Go live. This is the House Appropriations Committee. Good morning. It is Thursday, January 23rd, 2025. It's about 10:15 or so, and we have with us Hardy Merrill, Deputy Commissioner of Finance and Management. We're going to be discussing carry forwards and reversion. And appreciate you got started a little bit later. So now I'll let you take it away. Thanks.
My pleasure. For the record, Hardy Merrill, Deputy Commissioner, Department of Finance and Management. And I've got two documents to share. One of them is a report on carry forward and reversions, all appropriations carried forward in the general fund and all reversions proposed from appropriations to the general fund. And that report was required for submission per 2024 Act 87, Section 103C. Before getting into that report, I thought I would just briefly address first the statutory and session law basis for carry forward and reversions, what we're talking about, and also briefly describe our internal process for that Department of Finance and Management is for managing approval of carry forward for expenditure, which is a duty that the department performs on behalf of and assisting the Secretary of Administration. So I'll start first with a memo that I shared. The memo is dated June 28th, 2024. And so just prior to the close of fiscal year 24, the Department of Finance and Management provides this memo, which is essentially instructional in nature to all heads of agencies and departments and financial directors and managers in the executive branch. At the beginning of that memo, we cite the session law statute, which has, for at least as many recent years as I'm aware of, been included each year in each fiscal year's Budget Adjustment Act. So when we conveyed this memo, we were referring to 2024 Act 87, Section 103, which was the FY24 Budget Adjustment Act. We referred to the section of that act which provides that notwithstanding any other provisions of law and subject to the approval of the Secretary of Administration, General Transportation, Transportation Infrastructure Bond, Education Fund, Clean Water Fund, and Agricultural Water Quality Fund appropriations remaining unexpended on June 30th, 2024 in the executive branch shall be carried forward and shall be designated for expenditure. So essentially, and the statute is actually referenced on the next page of this memo. Pursuant to statute 32 VSA 703, all appropriations from all funds by default would revert at the close of the fiscal year. So the appropriations would vanish, turn into a pumpkin, as I like to say, if not for this session law provision that is dropped in every year by convention in the BAA. Kind of an academic question, but each year when I look at this, it occurs to me why it might not be incorporated in statute, since it's such a sort of a basic facet of our operations, and for very good reason. When we get into looking at the report, for instance, there were over $450 million worth of unexpended general fund one-time appropriations that were dedicated for a specific purpose that carried forward from FY24 into FY25. And if you think about it in terms of the financial and technical mechanics, if not for the carry forward provision, all of the programs would have ground to a halt immediately. There could be, no further expenditure that could take place. So it obviously, makes sense, especially when you consider the massive amount of funding associated with one-time appropriations and for specific purposes that often extend over multiple fiscal years, not just one into another, but can be even more. So it makes sense to have this this facility to allow appropriations to carry forward.
Okay, we have a question here.
Sure.
Is that the same concept behind the capital bill when we make plans on the capital bill where they say that a certain amount of money is bonded for, and then we kind of tuck it away until there's a certain amount of time before it can be used? Or is this specifically just for the one-time expenditures?
No, this is specifically for, this is separate from the capital bill. There may be some similar theories or mechanics, but the statutes I'm referring to pertain to appropriations and the laws governing appropriations in Title 32. And so according to statute, okay, there is no carry forward. There's no such thing as carry forward. And in statute, all appropriations disappear at the end of the fiscal year, except for appropriations to the legislative and judicial branches, which are automatically carry forward, or appropriations to the executive branch that are approved by the Secretary of Administration for carry forward and expenditure. And so by default, at the end of the fiscal year, we say we automatically, all appropriations are going to carry forward. And then we spend some time, we halt the spending, and we spend some time reviewing carry forward plans submitted by departments. And then we turn the spending authority back on or propose certain amounts to be reverted. And then we include those reversion amounts in the budget, in the governor's recommended budget adjustment act that we've just shared with you. And those are the reversions that appear, that are proposed on page 37 through 39 of the BAA, but they haven't actually been enacted yet.
So, and so when you say like the appropriations turned off, or then it's going to be reverted.
Yes.
Outside of the permission granted here, going back in time, with hearing, and this is a very one-dimensional thing, and it may be past history, but the idea that a division, a department somewhere may go, oh my God, it's June 1st, we have to spend our budget or else we won't get it next year. So we're going to buy 5 lawnmowers and keep them in order to zero out our budget in that particular place so that we can then get it rebudgeted. Is that what we're trying to prevent here, or try to look at? I mean, that may be a stereotype of government spending, but it is that idea that, again, to have somebody within a distant department say, if we don't spend it, we won't get it the next year. That's kind of the frame of thinking that I've heard. I have to look at it differently now that I'm on this committee. So is that, am I barking up the wrong tree? Or
no, I don't think so. I mean, our interest in managing this process and in having plans submitted, and our review and recommendation to the secretary for approval of carry forward for specific purposes or reversion, that is, that's absolutely intended to prevent what might be considered frivolous or non-essential or discretionary expenditures that may not be in the best interest of the state. So if a department ends up with a fair amount of funds that are unspent at the end of the year, you don't necessarily want that to carry forward just to buy new office furniture, attend travel and conferences and so forth. So we request from departments, okay, first, we instruct them in this memo how they can determine how much is left at the end of the year. There's a specific query they need to run in the financial system, and they actually can't know the final number until, for instance, in last summer, it was Friday, July 19th, 2024. By close of business that day, they were able to query and find out exactly how much after the dust settled of year-end closeout is remaining, because the closeout process actually takes that period of time. Once they determine that amount remaining, they have 10 days approximately to provide us with a plan for which they propose either intended uses of those funds carried forward, or whether they recommend funds for reversion. And then we spend about a month reviewing all that, and then deciding what spending will turn back on or what will keep turned off, and then recommend for reversion in BAA. So I think, sound fiscal management and addressing needs departments may enumerate and prove to us described in carry forward plans justifies, our authorization of the carry forward for expenditure. Otherwise, it's recommended for reversion in the BAA. For instance, in this current BAA, some $18.9 million was recommended for reversion. So that's almost like it's almost like found revenue. Most of our BAA capacity to spend came from revenue upgrade, but even in a year with no revenue upgrade, potentially you can have sources of revenue for budget adjustments. It's not exactly revenue, but you can have reversions that then can be reappropriated in a lean year. So that's part of, along with just the basic sort of principle I think you were alluding to of like sound fiscal management and not just spending money to use it up. There's also, certainly from finance and management's perspective, this very real need every year there are additional needs halfway through the year when we come to budget adjustment, and you can't always count on revenue just coming from economists or from booming stock markets. So that's really why this process, we really, try to manage as tightly as possible to ensure that funds will be available in BAA, because there will surely be needs for reappropriation. That's a little bit of, I think, a high level, treatment of our thought process and philosophy. Okay.
Did you want to, you were going to probably dive right in, weren't you?
I'm, you know what? I come to you today with no prepared agenda, and I'm speaking entirely off the cuff. As you know, the governor has a budget to present on Tuesday. So I've been so immersed in finalizing the budget that essentially I think I've spoken to, our process. And if there are no other questions on kind of process and law basis,
You could sort of walk us.
I'm happy to walk you through the report. So one of the things, so in terms of how to read this report, and this report, what I've provided is the detail for every general fund appropriation. And every appropriation, whether it had a balance remaining or not, is listed on this sheet. I addressed in the memo balances in other funds didn't provide detailed breakdown. They were all, for instance, transportation and ed fund. They were there was not as much to report there.
Right, and the general fund is our primary interest at the moment.
That's the main event. So in terms of how to read this, we in our carry forward review process, one of the things that we recommend and highly encourage departments to deploy carry forward funds for is potential upcoming Pay Act needs. And we've been actually pretty aggressive over the past few years in establishing more of a control process on that. And so the first column that says approved for Pay Act, what we did, if you go to the bottom line at the end, it ends up being $1.4 million across all general fund Pay Act appropriations, which we were able to carve out and set aside for to apply to a department's anticipated upcoming Pay Act need. It basically reduce the amount that has to be drawn from the executive Pay Act appropriation, which means there's more left over in that appropriation for other needs in other departments and so forth. Operationally, we actually carve these amounts out, and basically we turn off their ability to spend those amounts until the Pay Act process, which will be in the spring of this year, and Pay Act requests are made, and we see what people actually need to close out the, the fiscal year. And then we'll take these amounts and say, okay, you need, if you need, you need $1 million to close out. You're making $1 million Pay Act request. Well, here's part of it is this. And for instance, the one I see is my own department, budget and management. We've carved out $37,000 for your Pay Act need. We're actually going to give you that from turning on this appropriation you've already gotten rather than send you the funds from the Executive Pay Act appropriation, or we'll make up the difference from the Executive Pay Act appropriation. So we handle internally, that's a different column because we handle it differently. We don't give that spending authority right away to departments after approving the carry forward plan. The next column, which is where most of the numbers are and the big numbers are, it just says approved for other use by department. And that's where we're referring to amounts that are, that spending authority is turned back on, and it's turned back on for the purposes described in the carry forward plan by the department. And that's the amount that's being turned back on.
So
Sure.
pause you on that. Some of this, I'm guessing, approved for the use. It may not actually be approved for other use. It may be a timing thing.
Yeah, no, and this is something I remember talking about a bunch when I spoke last year.
Yeah.
Is that when we say other use, it's other use other than Pay Act. But it can't be for another use other than what the appropriation was for.
So that's kind of a little.
So I'm sorry that that's misleading for the committee. This is how our internal, this is derived from our internal reporting worksheet. And that's what it means is other use other than
non-Pay Act.
Other than Pay Act, but it can't be for, no expenditure can be authorized for a purpose other than what it's appropriated for. So for instance, there is, looking down here, for instance, the first big item is $15 million from the prior year Pay Act appropriation is being carried forward. It can only be used for subsequent Pay Act distribution. It can't be used for any other purpose. The dollars that are carried forward remain in that appropriation and can only be used for that appropriation. And in the case of one-time appropriations, they tend to be very narrowly defined in terms of the purpose those funds can be used for. Is that clear, or do I need to?
So for example, you have, if you went further down, AOA high risk FEMA denial reserve.
That's right.
13 million. You can't go use it for something else. You have to use it for FEMA denial reserve.
Okay.
And if you aren't going to eventually, you would put that in a reversion.
That's exactly true.
Right? That's where we go to.
The only way it can be used for a different purpose would be for us to, we would propose it for reversion, and then we would recommend in the GovRec BAA that it be reappropriated for a different purpose.
Exactly.
But the executive branch can't do that. It can only recommend that, and it can be enacted or not by the legislature. And Madam Chair, you raise a great example with that high risk FEMA denial reserve, because I believe in the language for the governor's recommended Budget Adjustment Act, that particular appropriation is actually referred to in terms of trying to expand the use, which is very narrowly constrained in terms of the FEMA denial purpose. And so there's a recommendation made in the BAA language to expand the use of that appropriation by changing the language. But that appropriation can't be used for those additional purposes unless that change in language is actually enacted by the legislature.
Right. So you can see that there's a lot of things there's some big things on here, which is why it's helpful to see this in the context of the budget adjustment.
Yeah.
Because the budget adjustment doesn't tell us what was carried forward.
That's right. And the majority, again, this report, it lists which appropriations are one-time and which are base. I apologize that there are not subtotals at the bottom.
There's stuff.
Giving the totals, but I calculated quickly before coming in, out of $514 million that's carried forward that can still be spent, the vast majority of that is related to one-time appropriations, for specific purposes. 455 million of that 514 that was carried forward are defined for these very specific one-time purposes. There was 58 million, a smaller component of base appropriations that were carried forward. And of those base appropriations, those are the ones that we're really looking at plans and reviewing and approving or recommending pieces for reversion. And I should also mention, in terms of our process, what we really encourage and look for are one-time purposes for the use of carry forward, as opposed to using them to just offset base pressure. We don't want to approve carry forward and have that offset wage pressures that would then come to bite in the following fiscal year. So that's part of our scrutiny and our budget development purpose. But
Seska has a question.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question about another example. It's right below the FEMA denial reserve, where there's health equity, community grants.
Yes.
So grant programs.
Yes.
So $500,000 reversion.
Yep.
For that. Can you just give a quick?
Sure, I can
agree of what that,
this
it doesn't have to be super detailed.
No, this particular example is another one that's instructive, because this is an example of, this is not, the appropriation was made to the Agency of Administration for use by the Office of Health Equity, which was initially established in AOA Secretary's office. It is subsequently, its permanent home is in the Vermont Department of Health.
Right.
And so the money didn't get used by AOA, but the only way, we can't move money, even if we want to, or if it makes sense, or it's in concert with legislative intent, which is the case here. The only way we can move the appropriation from the Agency of Administration Secretary's office to the Vermont Department of Health, where the office has ultimately been established, is to propose it for reversion and then propose it in the BAA for reappropriation to the Vermont Department of Health.
Different agency.
So that's actually a great example.
Because you have to take 2 steps to do it.
Yeah, just.
You can't just switch it over, right? So because the legislature has to sort of reauthorize it in a different area. So that's not one, it's one we should know about, but then we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, because we know what the reasons
about
of doing it, as opposed to some of these other ones. Like the Department of Labor has $8 million, and what's going on. So there are different ones that we. Thank you.
Sure. And the Department of Labor is it's very unusual. That's a very unusual case to have $8 million being reverted from a base appropriation. What the heck is going on there? And I can speak, the essential details of that one are that for a couple years, the Vermont Department of Labor was the beneficiary of a great deal of, in particular, ARPA fiscal recovery funds that had been appropriated for the large one example that I can think of was 13 million to support their UI program, the costs of which were greatly elevated during the pandemic. And so a large appropriation to support that program was made. But then as costs dropped off rather precipitously, but the ARPA funds were still supporting that UI program, meaning the general funds didn't need to be used and built up. And now they are able to be reverted and redeployed for other general fund purposes for anything. So in a way, it's sort of that's most of the story there with that particular example in the Department of Labor.
And they're coming in to talk to us, so we'll have more information then. Right, Stevens?
So as we put our heads down and start working on the markup of this, can I assume that, so these reversions are being made and they need to be approved by the legislature, but were they part of the calculations that the administration has made in their proposal for
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you're taking whatever the e-board report from July, whatever funds, plus this 18.9 or whatever the net
That's right.
is. To make your proposals, the administration's proposals for BAA.
And those reversions that you can track all these reversions in the language on pages like 33 and 35, 79, right?
Yep.
There. So you can find all of those. What's equally interesting is what is being kept and approved for carry forward. And so what hasn't been spent and why hasn't it been spent? And there's always, there's often a very good reason for it, but we don't always know what that reason is. So I'm less worried about the $30,000 one and more concerned about the $30 million one. But these were the numbers as of July 1st. Or what's the date of these?
Yes.
Carry forward is as of July 1st. So when you see a large number on here, it's changed
Right.
in 6 months. So some of that is what we're going to find out. I mean, we noticed that there's some housing stuff that's quite a bit of carry forward. And so, I'd be curious to know how much of that has actually been spent since July 1st, for example.
Yep.
So we will do our little research into that.
And
I don't know if you have updates on what this looks like as of 12/31, or is that?
I do not have a comprehensive, rerun
Yeah.
of this, as of the current date. I've looked into specific, on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
We might look at something if someone, for instance, if a department is making a request for the governor's FY26 budget for a specific purpose.
Right.
We'll be looking at what may be remaining, for a similar purpose now. And is this really all obligated? Do you really need this much more?
Exactly.
So we do. So really, it's on a case by case basis that we try to dig in during budget development.
Right.
What's really needed in terms
Exactly.
of.
And this will help us when we get the governor's budget, because they're looking at it and we have the opportunity to look at it. And now both for budget adjustment as well as, because if we were concerned that something was missing that we need to spend money on, and we find that there's a lot of carry forward, well, maybe that's why it wasn't in the governor's budget. So that's the sort of stuff we need to understand.
And sometimes it's as simple as timing at the end of the fiscal year. And one of the reasons again, for it being so vital to have that carry forward provision, there could just be a timing issue that you're expecting to make a payment in June, but for whatever reason, you're not invoiced. And we control, in terms of the budget, in terms of appropriations, and in terms of accounting controls, it's all on a cash basis. So we provide our financial reporting on an accrual basis, the annual comprehensive financial report. But in terms of the actual controls, it's all cash, and it's based on the fiscal year. So if we're expecting a $20 million invoice for something in June, but we don't get it for whatever reason, and then we get it in July, we need to have that spending authority carry forward so that we can, it's still there to spend it in July. And an example I see as we're just going through, like there's one on page 3 of 10, $4 million for Vermont State Colleges for system transformation.
Right.
And I don't remember the story exactly behind this, but why they did. I mean, this was something they were appropriated to draw down, but they didn't get it. They obviously want it.
Right.
So we didn't,
Right. I mean, so that's John's budget. And so you might go ask what's happening there. Maybe they've spent it by now because that was July 1st.
So for instance, the administration could play a dirty trick and revert it as of July 1. That wouldn't make any sense at all. We want that to carry forward. That's an example of a timing thing for whatever reason.
Right. Exactly.
It wasn't drawn down. They're obviously counting on it. So we approve the carry forward.
Right, yeah, that, we have a deal with
And
it.
it's,
That would be
so
good.
that's so that's an example of timing, which, affects a lot of these. And for your, to give you a little bit of arcane, technical knowledge that might help you as you look at these appropriations, there's the numbers on the far left, which is, the department ID or DEPT ID. So that's the actual code for the appropriation set up in our Vision financial system. The first four numbers refer to the business unit that the appropriation is made to. And then there's the numbers 89 would represent a one-time, and otherwise it's a base appropriation. Then there's two numbers which refer to the year the appropriation was made in. So you can see all the 22s were appropriated in fiscal year 22. So that means they've actually been carried forward multiple years since then, right? And so forth. So 23 would be in FY 23, 24 would be in FY 24. So that's that gives you a little bit more insight. You can tell at a glance that this is something that has been ongoing for a while, or this need has been, identified quite a while ago.
Right, so I'm looking at that, and under agency administration, right near the top, you have Vantage. It's been going on since 22 for
That's right.
6 million.
That's the
ERP.
That's the initial appropriation that was made for the ERP modernization.
And it's still there.
Which is, well, because that project is just barely
I know.
commencing. So the tap is really being turned on right now on that. Yeah,
So we'll see a different number next year.
that will surely be the case based on the contract that is underway.
Yes.
And the payment schedule associated with that. Yep.
Great. Good. Any other questions? Oh, you had a question. I'm sorry, Revolution.
Veterans Home. I mean, I know they're coming in.
They're coming in at 11.
But it-
Oh, is there a question on there? Yeah.
Yeah,
Where?
on page 6, we're gonna have the Veterans Home come in here. But on page 6, Veteran Home, it's down about a third of the way. See, it's
Yeah.
3,300.
Yep.
They're coming in for a budget.
Yeah.
Up and down the just the basis. And wrong fiscal year, I think they're.
Okay, so what you're seeing, Senator LaRoche, is the fact that they spent all of their FY 24 appropriation. They had nothing left
Yes.
to carry forward. And so that is,
So the only way there to be a budget adjustment is they had carry forward, and we were and then we were going to approve it for.
well, what we would have done, if they had any funds left at the end of fiscal 24, we certainly would have approved the carry forward of those funds, because we would have expected they would have additional needs likely for budget adjustment. There was not, they spent their entire appropriation, so there's nothing to be carried forward. Then they received, as of July 1, their FY 25 appropriation and began spending from their FY 25 appropriation. Now that we're halfway through FY 25, they're saying, this isn't going to be enough. We're going to need to ask for more in FY 25. And that's what's informing the FY 25 budget adjustment.
And that's what's going to change. We're going to start not using the budget adjustment as their budgeting balancing.
Right, because their original budget was obviously, there had to be a reason why the budget was a third of approved budget, governor's recommend or whatever, was a third of what their normal budget would have been. And that had to be for some business inquiry method, I would think.
Without, I didn't come prepared to describe the Veterans Home in detail, but I can provide, I guess, the real brief summary of the history as to why things were so out of balance. Is that, so historically, they receive, it's something like 2 years after the fact, a very large settlement related to the state Medicaid. And in the past, so we used to count on receiving that in BAA. And so they would be budgeted low because there would be every year, something like a couple $1 million coming back in.
4 million, I think.
So the budget was lower, but knowing that these millions are coming in BAA, and what happened is over the past several years, their operating costs simply increased greater than the amount of those settlement payments. A lot of that related to the travelers and those costs, and then other factors, and including, I think, the declining census, other things at play. But you're correct that, and you will see in the 26 governor's recommended budget, a much larger amount for that veterans home. But again, back on this report, what it shows is simply that they expended the entire appropriation and there was nothing left at the end of 24. Thanks.
That's good. Rep Dickinson.
Yeah, when you talk about that, we had that in the BAA for 24 this time last year. They put a lot of money into it. I mean, we put a lot of money into that to make up their budget shortfall. But by the time they got to July 1,
It was all
it
gone.
was all gone.
Yep.
So now we're in 25 and now they're coming.
Which
into
means it
another
was,
big-
their budget adjustment was not frivolous by any means.
Okay.
It was certainly needed. If there had been a budget adjustment and then there were funds remaining at the end of the year, that's where you would say, hey, what?
They've also been budgeting the last few years because you've told them 3%, like you have the budget letter that says 3%. And the only way they can do that is to come back at budget adjustment to say we need all the rest of it. And so that's what we said last year. We kind of put our foot down and said, no more of this. We talked to you and Adam about that. And so that I think that now they're supposed to be budgeting for the whole amount, which means that 1 year they're not going to be 3%. It's going to be some enormous number because then we won't be having this budget adjustment issue anymore. So I'm hoping that's what's happening for FY 26.
You'll see a very large increase.
Yeah, which is right. I mean, that's the way it should be. So we're getting back on the cycle instead of using budget adjustment as the balancing tool. Right. So,
Well, we also have a new member that's take care of that area, make sure it happens.
yeah, I know. So,
I thought that.
So, committee, does anybody have any more questions for Hardy at this point? We can always chat with him, or now you can start looking through your own areas and dig into it a little bit more. Hardy, this is really great. This is always really helpful to have. So we
Okay.
appreciate you coming in, appreciate you, your flexibility and time.
Sure.
Committee, we're gonna start the veterans home at 11:05 because we haven't had our break. We were supposed to get half an hour and now we're gonna get 10 minutes. So let's go.